Welcome back. This is another installment at Westminster Presbyterian Church in our series on the Newer Testament called Who Do You Say I Am? Engaging the Newer Testament. And our topic today is Paul's letter to Philemon. And our guest is Emerson Powery. Thanks, Emerson, for being here. You, as you know, are Dean of the School of Arts, Culture, and Society and Professor of Biblical Studies at Messiah University, and that's in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Northeastern corner, if I remember correctly, or air
Somewhat,
segment?
somewhat central. I mean, they usually people say northeastern, but it's more central, just south of Harrisburg, the
There you
capital.
go.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thanks for being with us and helping us with Philemon. Maybe we should just start with the cast of characters in this book. 'Cause it's a very personal letter, and you almost need a board or a program sometimes to make sure you know the relationships and the names, right?
Yeah, for sure. And usually when we think about some of the differences between this letter and other letters, we think, right, the language that you use, that it feels more personal, whereas the other ones feel as if they're letters addressed to full churches. And certainly that's true. But the folks that are mentioned at the beginning, Philemon, Apphia, Archippus, seem to also kind of take us into a house church. So in that sense, it may feel more personal, but it's still not quite personal in the sense of just an individual who's being addressed, right? Multiple
Right.
people are being addressed, and lots of people at the end of the letter, lots of overlapping names from the letter to the Colossians. Just lots of overlap. Says something about the the network of early Christians to one another, right? Christ followers are connected to one another in ways that are really interesting and intriguing and difficult sometimes for interpreting.
Yeah. Is it fair then to assume that Philemon's not the only one reading this? That like this is more than just politeness from Paul, but this is kind of a public, which would hold Philemon accountable in some way for whatever's going to happen. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, I think that's quite fair, quite accurate. And also the right speaks to this um, larger social context of letter writing and letter reading, right? So
Mhm.
most people, as we know, can't read individually. Whether Philemon himself could actually read is difficult to discern from the letter. If he's one of the large majority of people in the Greco-Roman world, then it's likely he couldn't read and he would need someone to read it for him. So it's not surprising that a letter would go to a larger group of people. Presumably, a person there would be able to then read it out loud for the rest of us to hear. So, but it also does speak to what you kind of alluded to, right? So it does kind of hold Philemon a bit more accountable because people are then aware of his own kind of private news, right? So that speaks to the ecclesial community in the first century and the ethical dimensions that are certainly associated with many of these letters.
Yeah.
So how does that kind of semi-public setting affect Paul's style here? The way that he addresses Philemon, the way that he approaches the content of this letter.
Yeah, in some ways, there are many scholars who think about Philemon as Paul's most sophisticated rhetorical letter. So that in some ways, it kind of stands out as distinct in some ways, because Paul says things like, "Well, you really know that I could command you, but I'm going to take a different approach this time." So that really it comes across different rhetorically, and it speaks perhaps to Philemon's own status in the world, perhaps just kind of in terms of social cultural status. Paul's status is not quite as high as Philemon's, perhaps. That's why he's kind of shaping the letter in such a way, even though he's going to come back around and switch that around a little later in the letter and talk about what Philemon owes to him, right? So there's going to be kind of a shifting of status language that's going to happen there later. But it's quite sophisticated in terms of the rhetorical nature of the letter even to the very to jump to the end, right? The very nature of Paul saying something like, "Oh, and by the way, please prepare a bed for me because I plan to come by, right? So that's certainly, I don't assume to think that Paul didn't mean it, that if he had the opportunity to visit, that he plans to stay with Philemon. But I also know that there's a rhetorical value in that kind of statement, that keep in mind that it is possible that I could come along and take a look and see what's happening in the household there. So, yeah.
So the big issue, I think, and people will learn this pretty quickly if they didn't already, is there's questions about who this Onesimus or Onesimus is. Is he he's referred to as being could be more than a slave, but a beloved brother. And so the question is this really an enslaved person in the ancient world, or is this part of the rhetoric? And if so, how was he not with Philemon? How is he with Paul? And this is all we have, right? Because there's no other references. There's another reference to an Onesimus, but we don't know if it's the same person, right? And
yeah, right. There's another reference.
How do we crack this open?
But yeah, but it's hard to know if that's the same person over in Colossians, right? So that's a much more challenging question in many ways. But what we know that Onesimus is somehow attached to Philemon, it seems, from this letter. In light of the way that Paul talks about that relationship, it seems as if Onesimus is one who is possibly enslaved to Philemon. I think that is probably more certain from the letter that we have than the other piece, which is much more difficult to know, is how Onesimus ends up with Paul. And in the long tradition of interpreting this letter, a large majority of folks suggest that Onesimus is a person who is a fugitive of sorts, who has ran away and somehow ended up in the cells with Paul, right? So that's not so easy to discern from reading this letter. So we do know that Onesimus seems to be with Paul, but exactly how he got there is harder to know. So we know from some other letters that there are occasions in which the church sends people to Paul to support him in some way or other in the ministry. Perhaps Onesimus came in that way. Again, not easy to know for sure how Onesimus ended up with Paul. But we do know that there's been some kind of careful relationship that's happened between Paul and Onesimus. And now Paul feels as if Onesimus is his very heart, as he says, right? So there's this much more intimate relationship now between Paul and Onesimus in his desire to send Onesimus back to Philemon. And then the rhetoric of the letter suggests that he wants some kind of action from Philemon. Exactly what that is also debated in scholarship. Does he want Onesimus to be completely free from and disentangled from Philemon's ownership, or does he want a different kind of relationship? Does he want Philemon, to treat Onesimus better, perhaps? And so is Onesimus expected to become a full brother who is now free, or is he expected to become an enslaved brother, right? A brother who is also enslaved. So it's really complicated, I think, just based on the words that we have in front of us. And scholars are divided on these matters. So we should ourselves, I think, cautiously enter in and make judgments accordingly, right? So one other thing I would say about Onesimus that is kind of interesting is what his name means something, right? His name means useful or beneficial. And that shows up in the letter as well, right? Paul at one point says, formerly he was useless to you. Exactly what he means by that is hard to know, but now he is useful, right? So Paul plays off of his name, both speaking to the rhetorical nature again of the letter, but also, I think, saying something about Onesimus. And it's one of the challenges for me is I wish we could hear from Onesimus directly, right? So we hear only from Paul, and that's just the nature of letters. Letters are one-sided. We're listening in on people's mail, and what complicates that even further is we're listening in on people who live in the ancient world. We're listening on their mail in the ancient world. So we have not only the nature of the genre of a letter, but we also have the nature of centuries, right, in between us, and culture, vast cultural differences between us. So all of that kind of complicates things for us. And those of us who may have grown up in ecclesial circles, we also have lots of theological history and lots of tradition that's associated, right? So Paul can't mean this, or Paul can't mean that, because whatever it might think about our own theological conclusions that we might draw. So those also have implications for how we interpret, for sure.
Yeah. You're speaking with a great deal of humility about what we can and can't know about the contents of this letter, its authorship, whose perspectives we don't have access to. And yet, over the centuries, people have spoken with great certainty about this letter, as though it is, ammunition in one side or another of debates about the ethics of enslavement and other issues. So, what can you tell us about sort of the interpretive history of this letter and how people have used it over the years? For something so short with so many questions around it,
Sure.
It's sort of punched up of its weight.
Yeah, and I do think this is where we kind of recognize not only this letter, but the Bible itself functioning in American history, right? So we come to this letter as people informed by an American historical context that includes slavery, right? It includes the Civil War, periods leading up to the Civil War. So in 1850, there's this extraordinary document that goes out. It's some people call it the 1850 Compromise in American history, but it's a document that is being debated in Washington, and it's about on the one hand, the inclusion of new states that are coming into the Union. But there are some who are saying, well, you can include those states, but give us something too. So some of the folks in Southern politicians, representatives wanted something in return. We will allow you to include that state as a free state, but give us something in return. So this fugitive slave law of 1850 becomes a really prominent moment, right? Document that all American citizens must somehow participate in the recapture of fugitive slaves if some have escaped to the north. Huge kind of political debate are happening around this, and lots of theologians speak into it. Even some people think about as kind of the father of American biblical history. Moses Stewart is a great prominent scholar of the Bible, and he writes a document related to this fugitive slave law. What's interesting to me is how the letter to Philemon, we have evidence on both sides. So some people are taking this letter, and those who are pro-slavers, and are preaching this letter and using some of the language of the letter, particularly the idea that Paul is willing to send Onesimus back, right? So they're using that as kind of central to how they're interpreting the letter, and saying that kind of supports the practice of enslavement in our own day. And others are on the other side, also using the letter, also preaching sermons with the use of this letter, and saying that Paul is saying to receive him back, but more, right? Receive him back as more than a slave, right? As a brother, a beloved brother, even in verse 16. So there's this, and from their interpretation, they're saying Paul is saying to free him, to give him his papers, so to speak. So we have this letter kind of showing up, particularly around 1850, and we certainly have evidence of its usage before then. But around 1850, around the Fugitive Slave Law Act in the U.S., it becomes a really prominent document in lots of ecclesial circles, and it's prominent on both sides of this debate, on both sides of this argument, which speak, I think, to some of its kind of complexity in terms of the historical interpretation. It's one of the things I like to do in my classes. Usually when I teach Philemon, I break the students up into two groups, and force one side of the class to take the pro-slavery side and force the other side of the class to take the abolitionist side, and then to make use of this letter in that conversation and to talk about the evidence that they find in this letter for their respective sides. And that allows us an opportunity to think about the complexities of interpretation, right? And even though we're attempting to do that, attempting to situate ourselves in the 19th century, I recognize that for many of my students, right, they want to say, well, no, at the end of the day, when we think about kind of hermeneutics and the history of interpretation, surely Paul couldn't have meant, right, and then whatever it is. So we're always finding ourselves in this American context with our own kind of American lens to read these letters, both in terms of even if in this example, in this 19th century moment, but then try to understand it in its first century moment. Those are all complex opportunities, really, for us, right? So,
yeah, it seems so hard to disentangle from all of those questions the fact that Paul is so vague in terms of what he wants. At least I read him that way.
yeah.
So this is verse 14, right? I prefer to do nothing without your consent in order that your good deed might be voluntary and not something forced. And
Yeah.
like, well, what's the good deed exactly? I mean,
Right.
it's
What's the
almost
good
as
deed?
if
Yeah.
it's almost as if Paul's saying, you know what I'm thinking, so do it, but he doesn't write it. Is that
Yeah.
fair, or do you experience the letter similarly?
Yeah, no, I do think that, for many of us, we wish Paul were much clearer, right? So I think that's some of the challenges of thinking about a first century context in which these house churches filled with Christ followers include both the freed, and the enslaved, right? So these house churches, in many of them, maybe less so in Paul, but certainly in some of Paul's letters, Romans, for example, Galatians, they're also including, right, Gentiles and Jews, right? So there's a complexity to some of these communities that also then give us something like 1 Corinthians 7, right, 20 to 24, in which Paul is saying, well, I really want you to kind of stay as you are, right? In the status in which you were called, stay as you are. But then we have this one verse that has been notorious for its complexity, verse 21, that says, well, even if you can be free, take advantage of that. Now, exactly what's Paul's tone there is really difficult to discern. Is Paul actually encouraging people or not to be free? Or is the emphasis in that whole section, stay as you are? So that's one challenge. And then you have the baptismal, what we call the baptismal formula of Galatians 3:28, right? No longer free or enslaved, no longer free or slave. All are one in Christ Jesus. And so what does this mean? Is this just about one's spiritual existence, or is there anything more to it? Does that have some real effect on the ground to the lives of the enslaved? I think these are real complexities. And my own sense is that Philemon is in some ways a window into some of that complexity. So Paul's rhetorical sensitivity speaks to some of those complexities. So perhaps he's not as clear because this situation is really complicated. And he knows that Roman law is on Philemon's side, right? So Paul has to be sensitive, and Roman law would anyone who hindered with the slaveocracy of the day could be jeopardized. So Paul is seems sensitive to that. Is there enough implication in this letter to suggest that Onesimus could be freed? I don't know. I think it's, again, I wish Paul were clearer. He clearly wants something from Philemon. He wants something from Philemon in relationship to Onesimus. He wants something from Philemon in relationship to Onesimus, and he wants to, hey, prepare a bed for me. He wants to confirm that it's going to happen. He wants something from Philemon in relationship to Onesimus, and he wants to confirm that it's going to happen. So he's also telling a Fia and Archip. I mean, so the house church gets to know. So there are these complexities that are part of this social network that we call the ecclesia in the first century. And yet, Paul is not as clear as what we would hope. And one of the things we know about slavery in the ancient world is that it doesn't end, right, with first century Christianity. So we have folks, Augustine and Chrysostom and others in the later centuries in early Christian circles still writing about it, right? We have Ignatius talking about the possibility of some communities maybe raising some funds in order to free some people. So there seems to be pockets of at least some communities thinking that some enslaved Christ followers ought to be freed. And yet we have others. Chrysostom is quite clear in some of his own sermons that he's still preaching in such a way that people, that Christ followers who are enslavers should not abuse their enslaved as much, right? So he doesn't say that they should no longer be slaveholders. He says, stop being abusive, So these are really complex communities that provide for us a window into challenges, I think, for those of us who live in 21st century Western societies, especially. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not just the sort of lack of access to power of early Christianity that lets it accommodate to this system, right? Like we see once the religion has actual political power behind it, it's still very much accommodating to it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Do you think that these ambiguities, this ambivalence that Paul is expressing here, do you think that's coming from, and this may be a question that we don't have access to, but do you think that that's coming from his rhetorical situation with respect to Philemon and the position within the Roman Empire of the sort of legal system he's operating in? Or do you think that these ambiguities are sort of inherent in his thought itself, right? Do you think Paul himself is ambivalent, or do you think he's needing to express ambivalence because of the situation that he's in?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Might be an unanswerable question.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is a complicated question. I mean, I think that on the one hand, Paul's rhetorical sensitivity suggests to us the complexity in which he finds himself in the Roman world. The fact that he is less clear than some of us might hope still doesn't detract from the fact that this is still rhetorically sophisticated. That is, Paul is still seemingly wrestling with something, right? So it's not so clear to me, and I don't know if I'm just saying this because I want my Paul not to be here, right? But yeah. It's not so clear to me that the Paul of the later, what we call the Deutero-Pauline letters, right? Slaves, obey your masters. That Paul is the same one who is rhetorically managing a letter like Philemon. Mm. So there seems to be this intentional ambivalence in a community in which he recognizes the law of the land, and yet there seems to be some kind of signs, early symbols, the baptism and that formula that they're announcing, presumably on a regular basis. Even if you say month or every few months, how often do you say that? And someone might say, I wonder if that has any implications for some of us, is that something we should be reflecting on, I mean, how often do you need to do that? Or do they just hear that as, that's good, spiritually speaking, but it's symbolic about our social status. I don't know, Paul, there seems to be enough ambiguity in the 1 Corinthians 7, and then in here, and then even in the way I would suggest other individuals show up and this is, I'm thinking even in Pauline letters, but also in throughout the New Testament, right? Someone like Rhoda in Acts, which on the one hand, right, Rhoda is this character in the book of Acts 12 that, they show up at the house, she runs away from the door, she goes back to tell people. So she seems like a stock character of sorts. And yet there are these named, enslaved, possibly likely Christ followers who are kind of part of the movement in such a way that people are writing them into the story. That the early church, these early Christ followers seem to have to wrestle with. They have to recognize that something is going on. So that's kind of how I read in some ways Paul's rhetorical language, that it's really challenging. The rhetoric itself is challenging. It's challenging to interpret, to know exactly what he wants from Philemon. And yet, I think some of the complexity of it is because it's not so neat and clear any longer. Once Onesimus has some kind of status change, spiritually speaking, of sorts, that has implications for Paul, at least the way Paul thinks about it. And he wants something different from Philemon. So, and if he wants Philemon, if he wants Onesimus to go back to Philemon and still be enslaved, it seems like even the rhetoric itself complexifies that for Philemon and for maybe other people in the house church. Philemon is now expected at least, it seems, at the least, not to punish Onesimus to the extent of the law, right? Is there more? Perhaps. Paul's own language suggests that there might be. So how much more is kind of that continuum, right? Which is really challenging for interpreters, for sure.
I think we have time for one more question and answer.
Yeah.
Margaret, you have one ready to go?
I've got one ready to go, Matt, but I just asked the last one. So if you've got one.
I'm happy to let you have the last question.
Okay, so my question is, what does this mean that this is scripture? Right?
That was my question.
Oh, is it? Okay. There you go.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably in some ways the most profound question, right? I mean, how did this short personal letter make it into the canon? How did they decide, right? That and we know, right? We know something about canon formation from some early letters, but it's not clear specifically about Philemon, how Philemon gets in this way. So how is this gospel? That's right. I think in some ways, right, Paul's own desire to see this, whatever the expectation is of Philemon, he desires that to be communal. He desires some collective awareness about this decision. I think there's something of a theological nature in there. But it's not just that. He also, this appeal, right? This appeal to Philemon on the basis of love. And not just on the basis of love, but on the basis of love lived out. That is, Philemon has served others well. He has been to the benefit of others. Now, why not further benefit that, right? So there's this lived out experience that Paul is appealing to that I think has implications for the gospel. And the idea, of course, that for Paul, certainly here, and I would contend even elsewhere, right, that whatever Paul is asking, whatever Paul thinks about the human person, there is certainly implied some sense of dignity that is expected here, right? Even playing off of his name, that he is beneficial, right? The name Onesimus. I mean, this is a quite a common name for someone who's enslaved. And Paul is trying to say something more about that, right? Don't just think of him in terms of uselessness. So there's something in how Paul appeals to Philemon on behalf of someone that he now considers to be his own very heart. So there's something kind of really striking about putting that forward, not only as a practical form of advice, but perhaps even larger, a theological claim that has ethical implications, right? So that the gospel that is preached, the gospel that is offered, can be rhetorically complex and challenging, but also needs to have real ethical implications. And even if Paul is not so clear about what those ethical implications are, I think Philemon might know what they are. He might know what they are. I hope he does. And I hope they are what I hope they are. I hope that, I hope that the conclusion is what I'm hoping. So that there is something really kind of striking even about the ending, right? About just prepare a bed for me as a gospel message. I mean, a sense of that we'll follow up, right? So there is a theological claim that has ethical implications, but we need follow up. We need to have certainty that we all can kind of even in our disagreement, perhaps when we are most in disagreement, to find opportunities still to come together and to recognize that we have more in common than some may think. So.
Yeah. I love that. I love where you went in that answer. I heard you say something along the lines of, even if Paul didn't know exactly what he wanted, he knew that the same old no longer applies, right? And he's trying to figure out what does the gospel demand. Yeah. Emerson, thank you so much for your generosity of time and wisdom. And it's great to introduce you to the people at Westminster.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the questions, Margaret and Matt. Thanks so much.